Hi, my name's Annie and I run Start to Stitch, an online sewing academy and a thriving community of sewists in my Facebook group Stitch Social. My sewists are based all over the globe and champion and support each other in their creative stitching adventures. At Start to Stitch, we are passionate about teaching people how to make friends with their sewing machine from the very beginning, where you take it out of the box, and perhaps you haven't taken it out of the box for a few years, right up to more advanced skills. One of the wonderful things about being able to use your sewing machine is to be able to repurpose garments or fabrics or textiles that are no longer loved in their original format, whether they're old or worn or broken or unrepairable in some way. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make the Kerr jewellery pouch out of some repurposed sea salt garments. In order to make the Kerr jewellery pouch, you're going to need some fabric. We're going to be using some pre-loved sea salt garments. The needle cord from this tunic will be the outside of the Kerr jewellery pouch, and the linen from these worn trousers will be for the lining. You will also need some iron-on interfacing, light to medium weight. You will need 2 meters of ribbon or cord. And then equipment-wise, you're obviously going to need your pattern printed out and cut out, a pair of scissors, a safety pin for threading your cord through, and a marking tool of your choice. I use a chalk pencil, but you can use whichever method you like. There are multiple methods for transferring markings. And finally, you will need some pins as well as your sewing machine. Before you start, you're going to need to print your pattern pieces off, and there's just one thing to note about that. When you download the file and you print it off, just make sure that you set your printer to 100%, not fit to page or any other such setting. It needs to be exactly as it's been designed to print. Once you've done that, you can cut out the 3 pattern pieces. These are a template for the big circle of your Kerr jewellery pouch, a template for the small circle of your Kerr jewellery pouch, and a template for the registration marks for when you stitch your segments in order to transfer them. You'll see what this is for later on. The Kerr jewellery pouch is made out of 2 lined circles which are then stitched together. So in this tutorial I'm going to be making the big circle out of an outer fabric, which in my case is the needle cord tunic fabric, and then that's going to be lined with some linen from the trousers, and then the 2 small circles are also going to be made from the linen from the trousers, so that when you open up your jewellery pouch, the inside is all the same fabric, and then the ornamental fabric is on the outside. Once you've got your pattern pieces, obviously you can cut. So I'm going to begin with the big circle. This is a piece of fabric that I've cut from the tunic. It's important, if you're repurposing garments, to make sure that you are cutting any usable fabric that is entirely flat, so no curved seams, because you'll need your circles to be entirely flat once you've cut them out in order to stitch them together. So for example, if I was using the trousers, I wouldn't be able to fold this area out flat because there's a curved seam here. There would be some shape and it would be very hard to stitch it all together. You can of course just use normal fabric as well, but today we're going to be using this lovely needle cord from this tunic. So I've used the usable bit from the tunic is got a seam down the middle. That's absolutely fine. I'm going to fold my fabric in half down the seam line, and then I'm going to fold it again this way so that I get a 4-fold area, and then I'm going to pin I just try and minimise waste by sliding that along. Then I'm going to pin my template to the quartered fabric and cut it out. Once you've cut out your circle, you need to transfer the buttonhole markings onto it. I've cut a little slit in the buttonhole symbol on the pattern. So just line up the pattern piece with the edge of your cut circle and mark the buttonhole on. And then on directly opposite, you need to mark the other buttonhole marking. You only need two, and they only need to be on the outer circle, directly opposite each other. Next, you need to cut a big circle in your lining fabric. In my case, that's the linen from the trousers, and also a big circle of interfacing. You can put the interfacing to one side, and we're just going to focus on the lining piece for now. Open that up, and we are going to transfer the markings for the drawstring channel onto the linen. The first thing I'm going to do is put my pattern piece, line it up with the outside edge of the circle, and mark the central point, which is a sort of tealy green colour on the printed off pattern, although my pattern is printed in black and white. Mark the central point, and then you can see how easy it is to transfer as you rotate the pattern piece around the edge of the circle, how easy it is to transfer these markings. The linen has a really beautiful drape in it, which makes it quite unstable, so you might see that I have to just occasionally reposition the linen circle as I go to make it line up with the pattern piece, because it moves so much, it's like butter. And you want to do that all the way around. Once you've done that all the way around, you can join them up if you need a steady solid line all the way around, or you can, when it comes to that point, just stitch by eye, joining these lines together. You need to apply your interfacing to your large circle outer fabric. So you do that by putting your outer fabric right side facing the table with the wrong side facing towards you, and then take your interfacing piece and put the gluey side, in my case it's slightly shinier than the non-gluey side, so that it's touching the back of the fabric. Some interfacings have a rough bobbly texture, and those are the tiny bubbles of glue. It's really important you don't get this wrong, because you will otherwise end up with a sticky mess all over your iron. So make sure that the gluey side is touching the back of your fabric. Line it all up and then press it in place to stick them together. Once you've interfaced, you need to make the buttonholes in the two places where you have marked them on the outer large circle. You need to cut two small circles out of the same fabric as your lining of the bigger circle. I'm using this opened up trouser leg, and as you did before, you're going to fold it in half and then fold it in half again, so that you have a quarter shape on which you can cut the pattern piece with a fold on either of the straight edges. I just wanted to make a note, if you are using repurposed garments, it's worth checking whether there is a curve in any of the seams where you've opened it out, because you really need it to be as flat and as stable as possible. I managed to get one small circle and one big circle out of the other trouser leg with minimal wastage, and I need to use this trouser leg for the second small circle. So fold it in half, fold it in half again, just reduce that a little bit. Pin, and then you can cut. You need to transfer your stitch marks onto one of your small circles, as we did before, and this is where your registration base circle stitch template comes in, as well as still the small circles template. So we're just going to pop that on and again mark the central point, and then you can mark the circle, the base circle stitch line all the way around by rotating the pattern around the central point as we did before. This stitch line will form the base of each of the segments in which you can store your precious bits and bobs. And if you didn't do this, you would have a deep V at the bottom and it would be very hard to get things out of your pouch. So once you've done that, you can use this one now, because you've created the shape where that goes. Line that up with the circle that you've just made, and then use this, I'm going to just avoid that seam, use these lines to mark the start of each of the top stitch segments. This will all make sense when we get to that point. So just transfer those lines, and then we're going to go back to this one again and line it up centre to the lines you've just made, and then you can draw a bigger line just to show where you will end the stitching, the general direction in which you'll be sewing when you start. And do that all the way round on all of the segments of the piece of linen that you've got. Now it's time to assemble your circles. So take your big circle outer fabric, place it face up on the table, and then your big circle lining fabric, and line that up on top. I'm going to do a bit of smoothing just to get it to sit nicely, and pin around the edge, because we're going to stitch all the way around the edge. You want to do that all the way around your big circle, and then you're going to do the same thing with the smaller circle. Put them right sides together and pin, line them up. I'm going to, because there's a seam in both of these, I'm going to offset them slightly so I don't have a big bulky place where I have to stitch over up to 8 layers of fabric. Normally I'd be really worried about grain and where the grain is and what direction the grain is, but you don't really need to worry about that with this, because it's a circle and you're going to get areas of distortion anyway. If you have a walking foot on your sewing machine, I recommend you use it, especially if you're using something as unstable as this linen, which is really, it's got a lot of movement in it. It's great for clothing because it's got a load of movement in it, and it has a lot of sort of natural qualities that make it really lovely to wear, and the finished item will look great, but you just need to take extra care when handling it. So pin all the way around, and obviously you do that on the big circle as well, and then on both circles you're going to stitch around the edge 1 centimetre in from the edge. Your seam allowance is 1 centimetre, and you need to leave a gap of about 5 centimetres on both circles so that you can turn your circles through. So don't go all the way around, because you won't be able to turn it inside out or right side out again. Don't forget to leave a gap of about 5 centimetres on both circles. Once you've stitched both of your circles, trim your seam allowance to about 1/2 centimetre or just under 1/2 centimetre all the way around, except for where you have left your gap. Normally you would notch on a curve, but we won't do that here because we want these circles to be really, really, really smooth. And notching, if you do them too far apart, can quite often result in a sort of straight line, slightly jerky circle. So we're going to just trim the seam allowance as close as we can to the stitch line, and then we are going to turn both of the circles through. Once they're turned through, you need to just make sure that the seams are properly rolled out, so you can slightly roll between your fingers just to make sure that there's no excess fabric and that your curve will be nice and crisp. It's easier to do with something like linen because it's a very natural fibre that creases very, very easily. So I'm going all the way, I can go all the way around the edge and finger press as I go and make quite a good stab at getting that really, really nice. If you aren't working with something like linen, you can also use a pair of scissors and poke them inside to just make sure that the seam is properly pushed out. You might want to take your scissors to the ironing board because the next step is to press these circles so that they're nice and crisp. As you're doing that, pressing your circles out, making sure that the seams are properly rolled out, you will also need to press this excess, so where you've left a slightly longer seam allowance, carefully press that return of the seam allowance in to back into the circle. Once you've pressed your circles, you will need to hand stitch shut the gap on the small circle using a ladder stitch or a slip stitch, whatever works for you. If you really can't bear to hand stitch, and some people just really don't love hand sewing, you can top stitch that shut, but from an aesthetic point of view it's much better to hand stitch that little gap closed, and then you can set that to one side. And then with your big circle, the first thing to do is edge stitch all the way around the outer circle, the outer edge of the circle. Edge stitching is just stitching maybe 2, maximum 3 millimeters away from the outer edge of the circle, and in doing that you will stitch that gap shut, so you don't need to worry about hand stitching that shut. Once you've done that, you will be stitching the channel back into your circle. If you find, as I have found, that handling it a lot has meant that you've lost your channel stitch marks, you can go back to the central point that you've made and remark them on, just bearing in mind that the outside edge will no longer line up because you've used up your seam allowance, so you really, really need to use that central point just to put those marks back on to your circle. So you're going to edge stitch as close as you can to the edge of your fabric so that it shuts that gap there, and then you're going to top stitch the channel in place all the way around the circle. So here's my big circle with the channel stitched into it, and I have also just given it a press to even out any wobbly bits where the bias areas have got a bit distorted under the sewing machine, and I've also edge stitched very, very close to the edge to make sure that my gap is closed. So I'm now going to put the two pieces together. This is my completed small circle. I'm going to line them up, so take the central point in your small circle and put your pin through it like that, and then find the central mark on your big circle that you made and stick the point of the pin into that, and then you know that they're both perfectly lined up. Rotate your circle so that you don't have any bits with a seam overlapping any other bits with a seam, because that will make for a very thick stitch line. You can see that although I have lined this up, using the central point. This is just slightly longer there than I need it to be, and that's partially to do with the way that the linen has distorted as I've stitched it. It doesn't really matter as long as your circle is, you know, as centered as it can be, and lining it up using the central point is a great starting point. Once you've done that, stick a pin in the middle section, and then pin inside each of the segments to hold the whole thing in place. And the time has come to top stitch on all of those markings that you made right at the very beginning, where I said, if this doesn't make sense now, it will make sense later. Now is the time. The first thing you're going to do is top stitch this circle into place. So again, if you want to just thicken up your marks, if you find that they've faded a bit as you've handled the fabric. This is a very tight circle to sew, so I recommend that you take your time. A shorter stitch length will really help you with your control, and also a slower speed will help. Once you've stitched your circle, you're going to stitch each of these, they're a bit like sunbeams coming out of the sun. You're going to stitch each of these lines so that you create the segments in which to store your precious bits and bobs. So I've stitched these together now. You can see what I mean by the base circle shape, giving you a base for each of the segments so that you don't have to reach too far in to retrieve tiny bits of jewellery, earrings and things that you might be storing in your pouch. And you may also be able to see where I've used a shorter stitch to be able to make that circle with more control. I used a 2.5mm stitch in order to do that. The final step is to thread the ribbon through the channels that you've made using the buttonholes. You need 2 1-metre lengths of ribbon or cord. I use a safety pin to do the threading, so just pop a safety pin on the end of a piece of ribbon and go in through one of your buttonholes and gently push all the way around the channel with your ribbon attached to the safety pin inside it, and emerge at the same buttonhole that you've gone in at. And then you're going to repeat the process with your second piece of ribbon, but you're going to go in at the opposite buttonhole and thread all the way round past the one you've just done and come out again at the opposite buttonhole, so that essentially you have 2 pieces of ribbon making circles around your pouch with 2 ends emerging from each buttonhole. Once you've threaded through your ribbons, tie a knot in the ends and trim the ends will be slightly frayed. In fact, that one's just still slightly frayed, so just trim them off at an angle, which will help stop the fray. Give it a bit of a wiggle so that you can even them up, and then you can gently draw in your pouch. Make sure that you pull all of those frilly bits that poke out at the top of the channel out, so that it closes up nicely. And there you have it, one beautifully finished Kerr jewellery pouch ready to store all your treasures in and to give to a loved one or keep for yourself. If you have a go at making this, please don't forget to tag us on social. We love to see your makes and we really love to cheer you on as you do it. So let us know if you have a go.